Where did you buy those cheap metals? Old man, a second-hand market. Judge Richard Hale burst out laughing right in the middle of the courtroom, his contemptuous gaze sweeping across the chest of Daniel Cooper, a 78-year-old man standing alone before the bench. Do you expect the court to believe you are a veteran, or do you think pretending to be a victim will help you escape an illegal construction charge? A few mocking laughs echoed in response. In that moment, Hale leaned forward, preparing to record yet another violation. A single line of text enough to crush what remained of Daniel's life, along with the secret buried beneath the ground behind his house. But only a few seconds later, just a single moment, the rear door of the courtroom opened in accordance with security protocol. The sharp sound of military boots struck the floor. The room froze. The man who entered did not look at the judge. He stood at attention and raised his hand in a formal salute, directed straight toward Daniel Cooper. General Michael Abrams, Department of Defense. At that instant, everything reversed. Daniel was not a fabricator of stories. Those insignia were not for display or vanity. They were tied to technical decisions that could once have killed thousands of people if even a single number had been wrong. If you were Daniel, would you remain silent in the face of humiliation from someone abusing power, or would you stand firm when the entire system believed you had no one backing you? Share your thoughts and subscribe to the channel, because this story is not an exception. Daniel Cooper lived on the edge of town, where the paved road ended in a stretch of uneven ground filled with gravel and weeds. Behind his low wooden house stood an old steel fence, separating it from a piece of land that had once belonged to a military base, now abandoned for more than 2 decades. Mornings there often began with cold wind blowing in from the empty fields, carrying the smell of old metal and damp earth. Daniel was used to that rhythm. He woke early, brewed weak coffee, checked a few vegetable beds, then spent the rest of the day on small, nameless tasks. At the age of 78, he neither sought attention nor left traces behind. The knock on the door came before the sunlight managed to break through the low clouds. Daniel opened the door and saw a man wearing a town-issued jacket, holding a thin stack of papers. The man's gaze swept across the house, then stopped at the back, where the corrugated metal roof of a small shed peeked out. He handed over the papers, his voice dry, saying it was just a formality. "Old man," Daniel took say, his fingers trembling slightly from the cold. He skimmed the first few lines, then looked up and said he would be there. The words were spoken slowly, without a question. The man nodded and turned away. Before stepping down from the porch, he glanced back once more, a look carrying the familiarity of someone who believed everything was already within the frame. Daniel closed the door. The paper in his hand felt heavier than it looked. Outside the window, a neighboring house drew its curtains. At the end of the road, another door shut. This small town understood very well how to protect itself through silence. The shed stood behind the fence, a small wooden structure with a metal roof. Its walls turned silvery gray by years of rain and sun. There was no lock, only a loose wooden latch. It did not resemble anything that could cause a dispute. Daniel stepped into the yard and stopped in front of it. He stood there for quite a while. His gaze was neither probing nor nostalgic, as if he were facing a question he had no intention of answering out loud. The wind passed through the metal sheets, producing a thin, steady sound. He placed his hand on the door, then withdrew it. The notice clearly stated the act of illegal construction and the requirement to remedy the violation. The line about enforcement was printed more boldly than the others. Daniel read the final section carefully. There was no paragraph asking why the structure existed. There was no line suggesting a conversation. Paperwork did not need reasons, only outcomes. He folded the notice and placed it into the pocket of his worn denim jacket. The jacket had been with him for many years, soft and old in a way that made people forget its age. The afternoon passed slowly. Daniel did a few chores, wiped down the wooden table, and organized his gardening tools. He did not touch the shed again. When the sun dropped low, the shadow of the old base stretched across the field, broken concrete blocks appearing like bones. Daniel looked in that direction for a brief moment, then turned back into the house. Dinner was simple. He ate slowly, chewing carefully, as he had been accustomed to for a very long time. Night fell quickly. The wind grew stronger, blowing through the steel fence and creating steady vibrations. Daniel sat by the window, the yellow light casting onto the wall. The notice lay on the table, beneath an old notebook. He did not open it again. What needed to be read had been read. What needed to be decided had been placed into the following day. The next morning was colder. Daniel put on his jacket, checked his pocket, and the paper was still there. He locked the door and stepped onto the gravel road. The town bus stopped on time. Inside, a few familiar faces looked at him, then looked away. No one asked anything. No one greeted him. Daniel sat near the window, watching the low houses pass by, then the empty plots of land where grass grew tall. The administrative building stood at the center of town, low and square, its facade painted a pale color. The administrative courtroom was on the ground floor. Daniel walked in, the smell of old paper mixed with cleaning chemicals, a few empty chairs, a long table at the front, no lawyer waiting, no reporters. Everything was arranged to move quickly. Daniel sat down in the last row. He placed his hands on his thighs, relaxed his shoulders. On the wall, the hanging clock ran slowly. A clerk passed by, looking at him the way one looks at a number already written in a ledger. A side door closed. Footsteps echoed behind the partition. Daniel looked around the room. There were no signs of a place seeking truth, only order, procedure, and the waiting of those who believed the outcome had already been decided. He inhaled, exhaled. When his name was called, Daniel stood up and stepped forward, carrying the neatly folded paper in his jacket pocket. In that moment, he understood that his silence had been read differently, and in this room, that misunderstanding would come at a cost. The administrative courtroom was located deep inside the town hall building, separated from the public reception area by a narrow, dim corridor. Fluorescent lights washed the pale gray walls in an unpleasantly cold hue. When Daniel Cooper stepped inside, the room was almost empty. A few wooden chairs were lined up in neat rows. The long table in front of the judge's bench was scratched and worn, and the documents were arranged in an order only those within the system could understand. There was no sound of conversation. The air carried the scent of neglected time, of mornings repeated in the same rigid sequence. Daniel walked slowly toward the back row, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He placed both hands on his thighs, back straight, eyes fixed forward. At the far end of the room, Judge Richard Hale was already seated on the elevated bench. Hale was a middle-aged man, a familiar face to anyone who had ever stood before the town court. He needed no introduction. His mere presence was enough to remind everyone that everything here operated according to predetermined rules, and those rules rarely favored the weak. Hale bent over the file in front of him, flipped through a few pages, and stopped at the first one. He skimmed it, eyes never leaving the paper. His voice rang out evenly, articulating each word as if reading a lifeless checklist. Building violation. Clear-cut. There was no trace of curiosity or consideration. To Hale, this was simply one item to be processed that morning, a task to be completed before the lunch break. Daniel stood when his name was called. He took a few steps forward and stopped at the position marked on the floor. The distance between him and the bench was just enough to create the familiar sense of hierarchy. Hale looked up for the first time, his gaze sweeping over Daniel as quickly as one might check a number. He asked whether Daniel had a lawyer. Daniel answered that he did not, his voice steady, offering no further explanation. Hale smirked, the corner of his mouth curling into a brief smile. That makes it faster. The words dropped into the room like a decision already made. Daniel stood straight, his hands clasped together, in front of his abdomen. He did not look directly at Hale, nor did he lower his head. The posture was not defiant, but it was not the usual submission either. Hale noticed it immediately. He was accustomed to hunched stances, averted eyes, trembling voices begging for leniency. Daniel's calmness did not belong to that familiar list of reactions. The room remained silent. There was no audience seated behind to witness the scene. No clerk was taking notes. Aside from a court employee bent over a small desk, there was no one to react, to whisper, to ask questions. Hale was used to this atmosphere. For many years, the silence here had always led to the same outcome. The person standing before the bench would leave with a stamped decision, carrying the feeling of having gone through a procedure rather than a trial. Hale continued reading the details in the file, the size of the structure, the construction timeline, and the violated provisions. He spoke quickly, as if afraid of wasting time on something undeserving. Daniel listened. Every word that was spoken bore the familiar tone of administrative documents, clear, rigid, leaving no room for context or circumstance. When Hale stopped, the room sank back into silence. Hale looked up again. This time, his gaze did not rest on the file but on Daniel. He examined him more closely. From his stance to the lines time had carved into his face, Hale's eyes lingered longer on the chest of Daniel's jacket, where a small piece of metal was loosely attached. It was dull, not shiny, not eye-catching. Under the cold courtroom lights, it looked out of place. Hale leaned slightly forward, as if he had just discovered something interesting. That piece of metal was not mentioned in the file. It was not listed as a factor, but Hale understood very well the value of things that existed outside paperwork. He had used them before to gain advantage, to steer a narrative in the direction he wanted. A brief glint of amusement flashed in his eyes. so quick it would have been hard for anyone else to notice. Daniel remained still. He did not immediately notice the look, or if he did not react. In that moment, the two men stood on opposite sides of an established order. One was accustomed to issuing judgments without explanation. The other was accustomed to living with decisions made by others. Hale leaned back in his chair, his fingers lightly tapping on the tabletop. He said nothing more, but this silence carried a different tone. It was no longer the gap between procedures, but a preparation for what would come next. Hale had seen what he needed to see, and in his mind, this hearing had just gained a new element to exploit. Daniel sensed the change, even if he could not name it. The room was the same, yet the air felt heavier. He held his position and waited. For Daniel, this was not the moment to speak. He understood that any explanation offered now would be placed under the gaze of someone who had no intention of listening. Hale lowered his eyes to the file one last time, then looked up. A faint smile appeared on his lips, thin and fleeting, like a signal only those familiar with power would recognize. In that instant, Daniel understood that this hearing had taken a different turn, and that direction offered him no advantage at all. Richard Hale did not speak right away. After the faint smile appeared, he allowed the silence to linger for a few more beats, long enough for the room to grow tighter with tension. His gaze returned to the piece of metal on Daniel Cooper's jacket, this time no longer glancing past it. Hale tilted his head, as if weighing a minor detail that had just surfaced in his mind, then rested his elbow on the table. He pointed toward Daniel, the gesture neat and practiced. "So, you want the court to believe you are a veteran?" Hale stretched the final word, his tone carrying undisguised mockery. The question was not meant to seek an answer. It was thrown out to occupy the space, to establish control. Daniel remained still where he stood. He did not lower his eyes to the metal, nor did he raise a hand to cover it. His gaze stayed fixed on a single point ahead, where the judge's bench ended. In that moment, Daniel understood that any explanation about the origin of the badge would be twisted into a form of self-justification. Hale continued without waiting for a response. "That thing looks like a souvenir bought at a second-hand shop." His voice was light, yet clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. From his position, Hale studied Daniel's reaction, searching for signs of embarrassment or anger. When he found none, he raised an eyebrow. A few soft laughs came from the back rows, brief and cautious. It was the kind of laughter from people who did not want to draw attention, but also did not want to stay out of it. The court clerk paused for a moment, then resumed writing. As if nothing had been heard, the room turned into a small stage, where ridicule was permitted because it came from the bench. Hale leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Or do you think playing the victim will help you escape responsibility?" The words were spoken more gently, but their implication was sharper. They evoked a familiar image Hale had used many times before, the image of people invoking personal circumstances to evade legal accountability. He waited for a rebuttal, an explanation, anything that would prove Daniel was playing a role. Daniel inhaled, then exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, carrying no defensiveness. "I never said I was a victim." The reply was brief, without added explanation. It did not follow the path Hale expected. There was no appeal for sympathy, no outrage, just a statement of fact. Silence settled over the room again. This time, it was no longer neutral. Hale leaned forward, his fingers resting on the edge of the table. "Then what are you?" His voice dropped, irritation beginning to show. This was the moment Hale sought to regain control of the exchange, to force Daniel into a predefined frame. Daniel lifted his head slightly, just enough for his eyes to meet Hale's. He answered, "Someone who is listening." The words rang out clearly, neither rushed nor slow. They carried no challenge, but no submission either. In this room, where language was often used to impose, Daniel's calm became an unsettling element. Hale sensed it immediately. He was accustomed to dialogues in which he completely dictated the tempo. Daniel's answer broke no rules, yet it refused the role Hale intended to assign him. That composure felt like an invisible slap, causing no physical pain, but striking directly at Hale's sense of control. Hale clenched his jaw. He glanced at the piece of metal once more, then looked back at Daniel. In Hale's mind, the badge was no longer a harmless ornament. It had become a tool. He understood that bringing it into the spotlight would help him reassert dominance, turning this hearing into a lesson about order. He began speaking about the strictness of the law, about how the court was not swayed by personal stories. The words flowed smoothly, like a speech repeated many times throughout Hale's career. Daniel listened, his eyes never leaving Hale, but his mind did not linger on the phrases. He knew this was only the beginning of something else. As Hale continued, Daniel noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The people in the room no longer looked at him as merely a case file. Their gazes moved between curiosity and caution. The small piece of metal on his jacket had accomplished what the warehouse never had, drawing attention. If you are watching up to this point and thinking this feels familiar, leave a comment saying, "I have seen this in real life," and follow along, because this is only the beginning. Hale concluded his statement with a slight nod, as if completing a necessary step. He bent down, picked up his pen, and began writing in the record. Daniel followed the movement. He did not know exactly what Hale was writing, but he understood that those lines would carry more weight than any words just exchanged. Hale's pen moved across the paper, paused, then continued. He did not read aloud. The silence now was decisive. Daniel stood there, realizing that the situation had shifted into another phase. The mockery was over. What came next would be expressed in the language of power, dry and official. Hale looked up after finishing the final line and set the pen down. The trace of amusement was gone from his expression, replaced by a cold focus. Daniel felt clearly that this hearing had crossed beyond the boundary of a routine administrative procedure. It had become a place for Hale to assert his authority, and for Daniel to understand that silence was not always accepted in the way he hoped. In that small room, the old piece of metal remained pinned to Daniel's jacket, quiet and tarnished. It said nothing, yet it had led the man on the bench to decide to add another line to the record, a line Daniel had not seen, but whose weight he could already feel. Richard Hale set his pen down on the minutes and lifted his gaze to Daniel Cooper, holding it a beat longer than before. That look no longer carried the faint amusement he had shown when he first mocked the badge, but shifted into something else, colder and more decisive. Hale cleared his throat, his voice sounding clearly in the courtroom, which was already quiet. He read aloud a new line that had just been recorded, showing contempt for the judge. Each word was pronounced slowly, as if he were carving them into the air. Daniel raised his head. A flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, not born of fear, but of the sheer absurdity being stated so casually. He said that he had not meant that. The response came out immediately, without prolonged thought, like a natural reflex. When faced with an untrue accusation, Hale cut him off at once. His intent did not matter. His voice hardened, leaving no space for dialogue. In that moment, the line between questioning and condemning disappeared. The hearing was no longer seeking clarification. It had shifted into another form, where explanations were treated as an obstacle. Hale leaned forward, both hands planted on the tabletop. The law requires obedience, not emotion. The statement was delivered as a self-evident truth, a proposition Hale believed no one in the room had the right to challenge. He had used it many times, in many different situations, and each time it produced the same result. Daniel stood still, his hand tightened briefly, his fingers curling firmly together. The sensation came quickly, then faded. He relaxed his hand and kept his posture unchanged. Daniel did not apologize, not because he failed to understand his position, but because he knew an apology at this moment would be taken as an admission of something he had not done. The room remained silent. Those present did not turn to look at one another. Each person kept their eyes fixed on their own safe point. That silence was not due to a lack of opinions, but to a habit of avoiding trouble. In this courtroom, standing on the side of the accused rarely brought any benefit. Hale continued writing. The soft scratching of the pen against paper sounded steady and even. He offered no further explanation for the basis of the new charge. To Hale, interpreting silence as contempt was sufficient. His authority allowed him to do so, and experience showed that few had ever successfully objected. Daniel looked toward the clerk's desk. The employee sitting there lowered his head a little further, avoiding Daniel's gaze. The movement was quick, but Daniel noticed it. It was not public shame, but a familiar reflex of someone who understood that it was better not to get involved. In that moment, Daniel realized he was standing alone, not only before Hale, but before the entire mechanism operating within that room. Hale looked up once more. He reread the violations, now with an additional line included. His voice was even, neither raised nor lowered, as if he were reading an inventory. Daniel listened without interrupting. He understood that any words spoken now would only be used to reinforce what Hale had already decided. Time in the courtroom dragged. The clock on the wall continued to run, but no one paid attention. Hale ended the reading with a slight nod. He looked at Daniel the way one looks at a problem that has already been solved. To Hale, this was the logical outcome of a familiar process. Daniel stood there, keenly aware of the shift in the atmosphere. The mockery from earlier had given way to another form of violence, more discreet but heavier. It did not need laughter or sarcasm. It existed in the lines written into the record, in the way an intention was removed from consideration. On the bench, to the side, a young woman who had sat silently since the beginning of the hearing adjusted her posture. Sarah, the public defender assigned to the case, had followed the entire development with growing focus. At first, she viewed it as a routine administrative matter, one of many files she handled each week. But the way Hale added a new charge made her feel that something had slipped off its usual track. Sarah glanced at Daniel. Then, over at Hale, she noticed the haste with which the judge seemed eager to close the hearing, as if some objective lay beyond what was stated in the file. Her gaze paused on the piece of metal on Daniel's jacket, then quickly returned to the documents in front of her. Hale went on to speak about the legal consequences of the violations, about the anticipated penalties, and about enforcement measures that could be applied. The sentences were neatly arranged, revealing no emotion. Daniel listened, absorbed them, but did not react. He knew that reacting now would change nothing. A growing sense of discomfort spread through Sarah. It was not simple sympathy, but a professional awareness that the procedure was being stretched in a dangerous direction. She looked back at the file, flipping through several pages quickly, searching for something that might explain Hale's unusual severity. Meanwhile, Hale concluded his presentation. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes sweeping the room as if to confirm that no one objected. No one spoke. Once again, silence fulfilled its role, reinforcing the authority of the man seated on the raised bench. Daniel felt clearly that this hearing had gone far beyond what he had anticipated when he entered the room. The violation notice in his jacket pocket now seemed like nothing more than the starting point of a chain of decisions in which he had no part. He stood still, waiting for what would come next, even though he did not yet know where it would lead. Sarah straightened in her seat, one hand resting on the file. She said nothing, but her eyes had changed. In her mind, questions began to take shape, directed not at Daniel, but at the very way the hearing was being conducted. She understood that if she remained silent, everything would pass, like hundreds of other cases. But she also knew that speaking up now would bring its own consequences. Hale bent down and checked the minutes one last time. He was satisfied with what had been recorded. To Hale, order had been restored, and the hearing was proceeding as it should. He did not notice Sarah's eyes following him, filled with growing suspicion. On the bench to the side, Sarah began to feel that something was wrong. Sarah sat upright on the side bench, her hand resting on the thin case file of the matter. The hearing had just crossed a threshold that made her stop seeing it as an ordinary administrative procedure. The way Richard Hale added the charge, the way he brushed aside every explanation, all of it unfolded far too smoothly. That smoothness triggered an instinctive discomfort rooted in her professional experience. She opened her laptop, connected to the data system accessible to the prosecutor's office, and decided to recheck the information concerning the parcel of land involved. The screen displayed familiar categories: parcel details, ownership history, and records of administrative transfers. Sarah moved the cursor slowly, her eyes scanning each line. The land bordered a former military base, which had been abandoned for many years, and was listed as pending disposition. Everything appeared normal, exactly like a forgotten file buried among hundreds of similar entries. But the sense of something being out of rhythm during the hearing kept Sarah from stopping there. She switched to the linked federal database, where records related to former military assets were stored separately. Sarah frowned when she noticed a small appendix attached to the parcel, containing only a few lines and little information, yet marked as restricted. She retyped the name of the land, then paused and changed her search method. Instead of the location, she entered the name of the defendant, Daniel Cooper. The system processed more slowly than usual. A small circle spun on the screen. Sarah waited, her sense of anticipation steadily rising. Then a file code appeared, brief and austere. Its status had been frozen for a long time. A warning line about access rights flashed for a moment, then disappeared, as if the system had automatically granted permission because of her position. Sarah opened the file. The opening section contained basic personal information, date of birth, and identification details, data that drew no attention. She scrolled down, her eyes stopping on a single heading line: Chief Civilian Engineer, Strategic Infrastructure. The words sat motionless on the screen, so clear that Sarah had to read them again to be sure she was not mistaken. She swallowed hard. Over many years of work, Sarah had encountered numerous files related to the military and former facilities. She understood exactly what that phrase meant. It was not a decorative title. It was tied to responsibility, to projects where even the smallest error could lead to serious consequences. She scrolled further and saw timelines, assignment decisions, and digital signatures belonging to individuals who had retired or passed away long ago. Sarah lifted her gaze from the screen and looked toward Daniel Cooper. He was still standing in his place before the bench, posture straight, expression calm. There was no sign that he was expecting this to surface. Daniel looked exactly as he had minutes earlier. An elderly man pulled into a cold courtroom over a small warehouse. The contrast between that image and the words on the screen made the air in the courtroom feel heavier. She turned back to the display and reviewed the file more carefully. It showed that Daniel had been directly involved in infrastructure projects during the most tense period of the Cold War. Technical appendices were marked classified, and many sections were partially declassified. There were no traces of self-praise, no commendations noted. Everything was recorded in a dry, precise manner, the way such work was typically documented. Sarah glanced toward Richard Hale. The judge was still rereading the record, pen in hand, his face revealing no emotion. She wondered whether he knew about this file. If he did, his dismissal of every detail related to Daniel became deeply troubling. If he did not, continuing the hearing along its current path would be a serious mistake. Sarah closed several windows on the screen, leaving the main file open. She inhaled, exhaled slowly, then stood up. Her movement drew the attention of a few people in the room. A chair shifted softly, breaking the prolonged silence. Hale looked up, his gaze passing over Sarah, his brow tightening slightly. Sarah stepped forward, one pace, maintaining an appropriate distance from the bench. She held the case folder in her hand, but her eyes were fixed on Hale. When she spoke, her voice differed from earlier in the hearing, firmer and clearer. "Your Honor, there is a detail that needs clarification." The sentence landed in the room like a heavy object dropped onto a table. Daniel turned his head very slightly, for the first time since the hearing began, and looked toward Sarah. His eyes showed no surprise, only quiet attention. Hale straightened in his seat, his hand pausing on the record. He looked at Sarah, his gaze now carrying a newly formed caution. Sarah continued, briefly stating that during her review of federal data related to the land, she had discovered additional information about the defendant. She did not read the content aloud, only noted that the file fell under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense and was directly connected to the history of the land's use. Each word was chosen carefully enough to signal the seriousness of the matter without creating an overt confrontation. Hale remained silent for a moment. He looked down at his documents, then back at Sarah. The confidence he had shown earlier was no longer there. He asked what kind of information she was referring to. Sarah replied that it concerned Daniel Cooper's former role, stored within a federal appendix. She spoke slowly and clearly, revealing no personal emotion. Daniel stood still, listening to the exchange taking place behind him. He did not turn to look at Hale. In his mind, no old memories resurfaced, only the awareness that a door had just been opened, one he had never intended to open under these circumstances. People in the courtroom began to pay closer attention. Several gazes turned toward Daniel, no longer carrying their earlier indifference. The court clerk looked up, pen suspended in midair. The atmosphere in the room shifted, from cold to tense. Hale leaned back in his chair, thinking for a few beats. He asked Sarah whether the information was directly related to the violation currently under review. Sarah answered that the degree of relevance needed to be assessed, but the existence of a federal file meant the case could not continue in the usual manner. That response plunged the room into complete silence. Daniel sensed the change in Hale's posture, a small adjustment but enough to notice. Authority that had moments earlier flowed in only one direction had now encountered an element beyond immediate control. Sarah remained still, waiting for a response. She knew this moment would determine the direction of the hearing. She also knew that once raised, the issue could not be withdrawn. Daniel stared straight ahead, saying nothing. He allowed events to unfold at their own pace. The entire courtroom looked up at once. Sarah stood upright before the bench, focusing on keeping her voice steady. She did not look at Hale immediately. Instead, she stared into the amaze ahead. as if reorganizing the order of the data that had just been brought to light. When she began to speak, every word was carefully chosen, stripped of personal emotion. The defendant previously oversaw the infrastructure of this strategic base. The sentence rang out clearly, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. A brief silence passed. Sarah continued, this time turning fully toward Hale. A badge lawfully issued during the Cold War. It was neither a defense nor praise, it was a confirmation. A confirmation grounded in federal records, digital signatures, and assignment chains preserved for decades. The courtroom fell into complete stillness. The court clerk stopped writing, pen hovering above the paper. A few people seated in the back shifted slightly, wooden chairs creaking softly. Daniel Cooper remained motionless, his gaze unchanged. He heard those words, as one would hear a technical report. There was nothing new to him, yet they carried a different weight in this room. Richard Hale leaned back in his chair. For a brief moment, he said nothing. His eyes swept past Sarah, paused on Daniel, then returned to the file in front of him. When Hale spoke, his voice was cold and decisive. The past does not create legal immunity. The statement was delivered like an immutable principle. He immediately added that what Sarah had raised were merely peripheral details. Hale's manner of speaking made Sarah realize that a boundary had been drawn. He did not dispute the authenticity of the records. He set them aside. It was a deliberate choice. Sarah looked straight at Hale and did not respond at once. She understood that arguing on the surface would not move the trial forward. What was needed was a different question, a deeper one. Hale lowered his gaze and flipped through the land records. His expression shifted, not from fear, but from calculation. He had realized that the case was no longer as tidy as it first appeared. Everything connected to the land now carried another layer of meaning. Hale continued speaking about jurisdiction, about the court's lack of responsibility to excavate history. Yet, as he spoke, his eyes flicked toward Sarah, as if checking what else she might still be holding back. Sarah opened another folder, containing data linking the land records with old technical appendices. She stated succinctly that according to archived maps and environmental reports from earlier periods, the area where the warehouse was built had once been a technical burial site. She paused briefly, then continued. Military industrial waste, solvents, heavy metals, and cleaning compounds, left unattended for more than 2 decades. Those words landed in the room with a weight entirely different from the administrative terminology before them. A few people looked up, their expressions shifting from indifference to alertness. Daniel listened and understood every detail clearly. He did not need to imagine it. He had once stood beneath that ground, had once signed infrastructure drawings designed to withstand the worst possible scenarios. To him, the warehouse had never been a storage place. Hale cut Sarah off, reiterating that the court was examining an act of unlawful construction. He stated that all other conjectures lay outside the scope, but this time, his voice was no longer as even as before. It carried a restrained urgency. Hale understood that if this line of information continued, the trial would veer in another direction, one where his control was no longer absolute. Sarah did not retreat. She said that precisely for that reason. Continuing the trial in its current form was inappropriate. She emphasized that federal records showed this land fell under special monitoring requirements. The existence of a structure, however small, could be connected to the concealment of a burial site. She did not accuse, she raised an issue. Daniel felt Hale's gaze turn fully toward him. It was no longer mocking as it had been at the start. It carried a cold assessment. In Hale's mind, Daniel's image shifted rapidly. The elderly man accused of an administrative violation has now become a variable capable of slowing plans that had already been arranged. Hale clenched his jaw. He stated that all decisions related to the land would be handled through procedures at a later stage. He tried to steer the trial back to its original track, where the warehouse was treated as an isolated violation. But the silence in the courtroom no longer worked in his favor. It became a sign that everyone had heard what was not meant to be heard. Sarah concluded her presentation by reiterating that the badge Daniel wore was a valid service credential, issued during a sensitive period of history and tied to technical duties at this very base. She did not request privilege. She requested consideration. Daniel stood still, adding nothing. He allowed the facts to stand on their own. If you think this is merely an administrative violation, comment, no longer a coincidence. Subscribe to the channel, because from this point on, nothing will be safe. for anyone who hides the truth. Hale looked down at the transcript, then back at Sarah. He said the court acknowledged the remarks, but emphasized that the proceedings would continue within its authority. The statement sounded assertive, yet it lacked its earlier certainty. Hale realized that any decision made now could be scrutinized again from a higher level. Daniel stared straight ahead. He understood that a turning point had occurred, even though the outcome had not yet surfaced. The small warehouse behind his house, once considered meaningless, had now been placed at the center of a much larger chain of issues. To him, it brought no sense of victory. It carried a heavy foreboding. Hale bent down, rearranging the papers as if trying to restore order to his desk. But in his mind, that order had already been disrupted. He understood one thing. This warehouse was not allowed to exist, and neither was Daniel Cooper. Richard Hale was at the familiar stage of the hearing, the point where everything usually ended the same way. He looked down at the transcript, rearranged the papers in front of him, his voice preparing to shift into a concluding rhythm. The administrative language was ready to be read aloud, neat and sealed. To Hale, this was the moment to restore control. After a few minutes of disruption caused by details he considered irrelevant, Sarah remained standing where she was, one hand resting on the federal file that had just been opened. She said nothing more. She understood that any argument now would be swept away if Hale managed to close the session through procedure. Daniel Cooper stood motionless before the bench, his gaze fixed forward, his posture unchanged. He was not waiting for a miracle. He was only waiting for what was inevitable. Just as Hale cleared his throat, preparing to read the interim decision, a sound rose from the back of the room. The rear door of the courtroom opened in strict accordance with security protocol. Slow and deliberate, the sound of military boots struck the tiled floor, dry and even, neither hurried nor hesitant. That sound cut straight through the familiar flow of the hearing. Every eye in the room turned toward the door. A gray-haired man stepped inside, his uniform immaculate, general's insignia displayed on his shoulders. His walk did not seek attention, yet every step carried the weight of long-established authority. His gaze was cold and focused, neither courting attention nor avoiding it. Hale frowned, his hand stopping on the transcript. He immediately recognized that the man who had entered did not belong to the town system. This presence had not existed in any scenario of the morning. Before Hale could speak, the man stopped in the center of the room, stood straight, and introduced himself briefly. General Michael Abrams, Department of Defense. The introduction required no further explanation. It was enough to completely alter the atmosphere in the room. People seated in the back straightened their backs. The clerk set down the pen. Sarah felt her heartbeat slow, not from relief, but from realizing that the matter had crossed beyond the boundary of a local hearing. Hale spoke, his voice tightening slightly. The hearing is in session. The statement was meant as a reminder, but it lacked its usual certainty. Abrams did not respond immediately. He withdrew a thick envelope from his jacket, stepped forward once, and placed it on the table before the bench. By urgent order, he said, his voice even, without emphasis. Hale looked at the envelope, then at Abrams. His eyes moved quickly over the seal and the signature. In that instant, Hale understood that he had lost the initiative. He had not opened the envelope, yet he already knew its origin. It was the kind of document that could not be ignored. Abrams turned toward Daniel Cooper. He stood at attention and raised his hand in a precise salute, exact, without excess or deficiency. The gesture was performed in full view of the entire courtroom, without concealment or detour. Daniel looked at Abrams, their eyes meeting briefly. He did not return the gesture. He only gave a very slight nod, just enough to acknowledge it. The entire courtroom fell silent. No one spoke. No one moved. The moment lasted just long enough for everyone to realize that the old order had been temporarily suspended. Hale tightened his grip on the gavel handle, the tension clearly visible in his hand. The gavel, the familiar symbol of authority in this room, now felt heavy and out of place. Abrams turned back to face Hale. He no longer looked at Daniel. His voice rose slowly and clearly, each word delivered like an official notice. This hearing must be suspended. The sentence carried no raised tone and no threat, yet it bore enough authority to extinguish any immediate reaction. Hale opened his mouth as if to object, then stopped. He looked at the envelope again, then at Abrams. In Hale's mind, countless scenarios passed in quick succession. Every option led to the same conclusion. He no longer had the authority to proceed as before. Any move now would be recorded at a different level. Sarah observed the scene with intense focus. She understood that this was not a random intervention. Abrams's appearance was the direct result of the data that had just been revealed. She looked at Daniel, then at Abrams, recognizing a connection that this hearing had only just touched. Hale cleared his throat, attempting to maintain composure. He said the court needed clarification on the scope of the intervention. Abrams replied that the scope was clearly stated in the authorization, involving defense property and an individual under federal protection. He said nothing more. He did not need to. Daniel stood still, listening. He felt no sense of victory. Abrams's presence did not give him the feeling of being vindicated. It confirmed what he had known all along, that what lay beneath the shed did not fall under the town's authority, and that touching it would trigger consequences no one in this room could fully control. Hale looked around the courtroom, as if searching for familiar support, but the eyes of those present all turned away. The order had shifted too quickly to adapt. He set the gavel down on the table, the movement slower than usual. The gavel made a soft sound, no longer sharp or decisive. Abrams remained standing, waiting. He did not press the matter. He understood that suspending the hearing required no further debate. It had already occurred the moment he entered the room. The silence now no longer served the local authority. It was the pause of a transfer of power. Daniel felt clearly that from this moment on, nothing would unfold within familiar boundaries. The small administrative hearing had become a point of intersection. He looked toward the rear door of the courtroom, where Abrams had entered, and understood that the road ahead would not be short. Hale took a deep breath, then looked at Abrams one final time. He nodded, very slightly, like a reluctant acknowledgement. In that room, the decision just made required no additional signature. The hearing had been suspended, and with it, Hale's entire original plan was placed on hold, waiting for another order to take its place. General Michael Abrams stood facing the judge's bench, maintaining just enough distance to keep the exchange within formal protocol. He did not look around the room, nor did he seek any reaction. When he began to speak, his voice was even and clear. The content delivered like a notice that all required procedures had already been completed. This matter directly involved defense property and an individual under federal protection. The statement landed in the room like a boundary marker, clearly delineating an authority that had just been established. Richard Hale leaned forward, his jaw tightening. He asserted sharply that this court had jurisdiction. The emphasis in his tone showed that Hale was still clinging firmly to his position, to the chair and the symbols that had served him for many years. But Abrams did not change his stance. He replied briefly, "Not in this case." There was no lengthy explanation, no debate. The answer was sufficient to close off any attempt to reclaim control. Abrams continued, stating that all temporary decisions were suspended. He placed stress on the word temporary, not to reassure, but to define a new legal status. What had just occurred in this hearing would be recorded and transferred to a different process, at a different level. Hale listened, his eyes fixed on Abrams. He understood the meaning of every word, understood that the authority he held had been placed on hold by the book, in the least contestable way possible. Hale struck the gavel. The sound echoed through the room, hollow and brief, no longer carrying its familiar weight. The gavel hit the tabletop and stopped, more like a final reflex than a decision. No one in the room flinched. That sound no longer controlled the rhythm of the hearing. It merely marked the moment a habit came to an end. Daniel Cooper stood motionless at the front, his gaze straight ahead. He did not turn toward Hale. From the moment Abrams appeared, Daniel had understood that looking back was no longer necessary. The words exchanged had taken place above him, between those who held authority. He stood there as a fixed point, not intervening, not reacting. For Daniel, silence at this moment was no longer subject to interpretation. It had been placed exactly where it belonged. Sarah exhaled softly. The movement was slight, but enough to release the pressure that had built since the start of the hearing. She looked at Abrams, then at Daniel. The sense of relief did not come from one side prevailing, but from the process finally aligning with its proper course. She gathered the file in front of her, reorganizing the documents she had opened, aware that from this moment on, her responsibilities had shifted as well. Abrams signaled to the federal security officers waiting near the door. The gesture was simple, requiring no words. Two individuals in neat attire stepped forward, choosing positions that ensured presence without causing disruption. The room retained its order, but it was a new order, no longer centered on the town's judge's bench. Hale watched Daniel. His gaze was icy, not attempted to hide his irritation. In that moment, Hale reassessed everything that had transpired. from the initial violation notice to the files that had just been opened. He realized that a decision he had thought insignificant had led to a chain of consequences beyond his expectations. The loss of control did not stem from Abrams's words, but from the system Hale relied on. Withdrawing its support, Abrams turned to Hale and informed him that the involved parties would be guided through the next steps in accordance with federal regulations. He did not mention personal responsibility, nor did he issue a warning. That calm carried a message clearer than any threat. From this point forward, everything would be examined under a different light. Hale nodded, slowly. He offered no further objection. His silence now carried a different tone from the silence he had once used to dominate others. It was the reluctant acceptance of a reality that had already been stamped into place. He returned the gavel to its position, releasing it, as if letting go of a tool that had just become useless. Daniel was invited to leave his position. He stepped back once, then turned toward the aisle. As he passed the row of seats, Sarah looked at him and gave a very slight nod. Daniel returned it with a similar gesture. There were no words of thanks, no exchange. That quiet acknowledgement was enough to connect them for a brief moment. The room began to move again. Chairs shifted softly. Papers were stacked. The clerk gathered records and notes. The hearing did not end in the usual way. It dissolved, piece by piece, making room for another process that was taking shape. Abrams spoke briefly with the security team, his voice low, the content not carrying beyond them. Hale remained seated for a few more seconds, staring toward the doorway Daniel had just exited. In his mind, his original plans needed adjustment. Abrams's presence had exposed layers of activity beyond Hale's control. He understood that from this point on, every move would be monitored at a higher level. That did not mean he would retreat. It simply forced him to change his approach. Daniel left the town hall in the cold midday air. The old stone steps beneath his feet were familiar. He paused for a beat, inhaled, then continued forward. Outside, the town functioned as it always had. Cars passed by, and shops were open. No one knew that inside a small room, an order had just been reset. Sarah stood at the doorway, watching Daniel for a moment longer, before turning back inside. She knew that the most difficult work was only beginning. Federal files were not opened, only to be closed easily. She prepared herself for the reviews, the questions, the pressures that would come from many directions. Hale left the bench last. He walked down the narrow corridor, his steps slower than usual. His expression remained unchanged, but inside, calculations continued without pause. He did not forget Abrams's gaze, nor did he forget Daniel's silence. Those two elements combined into a new equation, one for which Hale did not yet have an answer. 3 days later, in the darkness of night, a fire erupted. Daniel Cooper woke while the sky was still gray, the early light of morning just reaching the edge of the field behind his house. He stepped out onto the porch and caught the scent of something scorched mixed into the cold air. The smell was not thick, not sharp, but it was clear enough to make him stop. Daniel walked toward the wire fence where the warehouse had once stood. Before him now was only a darkened patch of ground, evenly covered in ash, with twisted sheets of metal scattered about like evidence of something already completed. He stood still for a moment, looking straight at the remains. Dawn rose slowly, the pale light revealing clean burn lines etched into the soil. The foundation area had been burned bare, the boundary so precise, it was hard to believe. There were no signs of the fire spreading. The surrounding grass remained untouched. The old wooden house beside it was still standing, its walls unmarked by smoke. Daniel understood exactly what he was seeing. This was not an accidental fire. A town police car was parked at the end of the road. 2 officers stepped out and walked around the area. They exchanged a few brief remarks and wrote down several lines. One of them looked at Daniel and asked a few routine questions. Daniel answered sufficiently, his voice steady. The officer nodded and said the preliminary report noted an electrical short. The explanation was delivered quickly, as if it had already been selected from a familiar list of causes. Daniel glanced toward the circuit breaker mounted on the wooden post near the fence. It had been removed many years earlier, leaving only rusted screw marks behind. He did not point this out. He also did not argue with the conclusion that had just been stated. Daniel understood that arguing now would not create a record, only unnecessary attention. The officers finished their notes and left a thin sheet of paper on the hood of the car. They got back in and drove away. The road returned to silence. A light wind moved across the field, carrying fine ash with it. Daniel remained there a while longer, letting everything settle. He did not call the police back. He knew he already had enough answers. Daniel went back inside and closed the door behind him. In the small kitchen, he washed his hands, dried them, and sat down at the table. Everything was still in its usual place. The ceramic mug, the notebook, the pen. Daniel looked around as if to confirm that the world inside this house had not yet been touched. He took a deep breath, then stood up. He picked up his phone. The screen lit up, showing a short list of numbers saved long ago. Daniel did not need to search. He dialed a single number. The call connected after a few rings. He did not speak right away. On the other end of the line, a familiar low voice answered and said his name. Daniel spoke slowly, without detour. The warehouse burned. The foundation was cleared. He paused, allowing the listener to understand fully. Then he continued, "They are starting to erase traces. If I disappear, you know where to look." There was no further explanation, no request. The line was silent for a moment. Daniel heard a soft exhale. Then the voice replied, briefly, "I understand." The call ended. Daniel set the phone down on the table and did not look at the screen again. He returned to the window and looked out toward the empty patch of land. The sunlight was stronger now, revealing the darkened color of the scorched soil. Daniel knew the fire from the night before had not been aimed at the house. It was aimed at what lay beneath the ground, at what had once been concealed. The warehouse had only been a shell. Burning it down was a message. Daniel brewed a fresh pot of coffee. He sat and drank slowly. The town outside was beginning to stir. Cars passed by, and the sound of shops opening carried faintly through the air. People driving along this road would see an empty lot and assume an old structure had been removed. Few would ask questions. Daniel did not expect them to. In his mind, old maps resurfaced, infrastructure diagrams, once drawn in, sealed rooms under lights that never went out. He remembered clearly the position of each soil layer, each pipeline, each buried point marked by technical codes. He also remembered why those things had needed to be covered, not to hide them, but to control them. Daniel stood and put on his jacket. He stepped outside again and walked around the land. He did not touch the ash or disturb the site. He observed and memorized. Every small detail was placed carefully in his memory. This was work he had done his entire life. When he was younger, he did it to prevent disaster. Now, he did it to recognize it. Another vehicle drove by slowly, easing its speed when it passed the ashes. The driver glanced over, then continued. Daniel nodded in greeting out of habit. Though he was not sure the other man saw him, he went back inside, closed the door, and drew the curtains. The light inside softened. Daniel sat at the table and opened the old notebook. He did not write much. Only a few short lines, enough to mark the moment. He closed the notebook and placed it in the drawer. What needed to be preserved had already been stored elsewhere, somewhere safer than a wooden drawer. If you recognize this kind of accident as familiar, leave a comment saying, "I understand," and follow along, because from here, the story moves to another level. Daniel looked at the wall clock. Time moved steadily, with nothing out of the ordinary. He knew this quiet would not last. When a trace is erased, the one who erased it often returns to check. Daniel prepared for that in his own way, silently and carefully. He slipped the phone into his jacket pocket and set the keys on the table. Daniel did not lock the door. He did not need to. Safety at this moment did not come from a lock. It came from information already transmitted, from a chain of procedures that had begun operating elsewhere. Outside, the empty ground lay still under the sunlight. The ash settled, revealing clean burn lines like a reversed map. Daniel stood at the threshold and took one last look before turning back inside. On the other end of the call made earlier, General Abrams had answered, and Daniel knew that from this moment on, every next step would no longer unfold in silence. The call ended very quickly, but what it set in motion was anything but brief. After setting the phone down, Daniel Cooper remained seated at the table for a while longer. He did not look out the window, nor did he look toward the empty lot where the warehouse had once stood. What needed to be done had been done. The rest was no longer in his hands. On the other end of the line, General Michael Abrams held the phone for a few seconds. After the connection was cut, he did not ask further questions. He did not request an explanation from Daniel. The 2 sentences he had just heard were enough. They carried no emotion, no plea for help. They were signals, and Abrams understood that kind of signal very well. Abrams set the phone down and turned to his desk. On the screen before him was an encrypted internal communications system. He quickly entered a sequence of commands, accessing the emergency reporting channel reserved for situations involving former defense assets. His fingers moved decisively, without hesitation. This was not the first time he had activated this procedure. An emergency report was drafted within a few minutes. The content was concise, focused on timelines and signs of unauthorized interference. Abrams attached the relevant files, technical maps, old environmental reports, and documents that had been partially declassified but never widely released. Finally, he attached another folder, clearly marked, the original technical file. These were documents that Daniel Cooper had retained from many years earlier, copies stored in full compliance with regulations, with signatures and verification codes intact. These materials were not meant to establish merit. They existed to determine responsibility. Abrams understood that once these files entered the reporting chain, the matter would move beyond the authority of any local government. Abrams sent the report to 3 different federal agencies, each responsible for a separate aspect of the issue. He added no personal commentary. The system would read, cross-reference, and generate alerts on its own. When he pressed send, a series of automated processes was triggered, requiring no further direct involvement from him in the initial phase. Abrams leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen for a few seconds. He knew that from this point on, every movement related to that parcel of land would be logged. Those accustomed to operating in gray areas would feel the change very quickly. He was not in a hurry. What he needed was for the system to do its work. Elsewhere, hundreds of miles away, William Crowley sat in his office when a notification appeared on his screen. Crowley was a regional chief judge, responsible for overseeing municipal courts in the area, including the court where Richard Hale worked. He was accustomed to receiving reports, but this notification carried an unusually high level of priority. Crowley opened the attachment. His eyes skimmed the opening lines, then slowed. The name of the site, the location, and the former defense asset code. He frowned when he saw the name Daniel Cooper appear in the appendix. Crowley scrolled down and continued reading, recognizing the attached technical documents that, in theory, should have remained sealed in archives. He immediately grasped the significance. He did not need to read to the end to know that a monitoring chain had been activated. Involvement from the Department of Defense, even indirect, always drew in other agencies. He rested his hand on the desk, thinking quickly. In his mind, the possible outcomes were rearranging themselves. Daniel Cooper, as Crowley had seen him only days earlier, was just a minor name in an administrative matter. Now that name was tied to original technical files, to a federal emergency report, to the potential exposure of a series of carefully concealed decisions. Crowley understood that from this moment on, Daniel was no longer an elderly man in violation of regulations. He had become a risk. Crowley stood and walked to the office window. Below, the city continued to function normally. Traffic, pedestrians, familiar rhythms of daily life. He turned back to his desk and opened another communication channel, encrypted at a lower level. This was not an official channel. It was used for exchanges that paperwork did not record. Crowley typed a few short lines and sent them. The message was brief, without detail. Handle the witness. 3 words were enough to convey intent. He did not believe he was doing anything unusual. In the system he knew, eliminating risk was considered part of maintaining order. After sending the instruction, Crowley sat down and adjusted his tie. He believed everything was still under control. Federal reports, in his experience, took time to spread and generate concrete action. That window of time was what Crowley relied on. Back at the wooden house on the edge of town, Daniel Cooper stood by the window, looking out at the empty lot. He knew nothing of the report that had just been sent, nor of the order that had just been issued elsewhere, but he understood the logic of what was unfolding. When a trace is erased, the next step is usually to remove the person who knows that trace best. Daniel did not panic. He opened a drawer, checked a few small items, and placed them back in their familiar positions. He did not pack a bag. He did not write a letter. Those actions were not part of his habits. Instead, he reviewed what had already been transmitted, what had already been set in motion. Somewhere within the federal system, alerts were beginning to appear on dashboards that Crowley could not see. But at this moment, he believed he was still one step ahead. He believed the order he had just sent would be carried out swiftly, before official procedures had time to tighten their grip. The call between Daniel and Abrams had ended long ago. It had not lasted. It had carried no emotion, but it had set 2 parallel chains of action in motion. One is moving toward exposure, one is moving toward silencing, and at the intersection of those 2 chains, the name Daniel Cooper became the center of another decision, made in silence. The afternoon moved slowly, the sunlight fading over the field behind Daniel Cooper's house. After the fire, the empty land carried an unusual silence, as if it too were waiting for something. Daniel was inside the house, and the door was left slightly ajar. He did not turn on the lights. The light from the windows was enough to see everything that needed to be seen. He sat near the table, back straight, ears attuned to the smallest sounds from outside. The The sound of a vehicle stopping on the dirt road was not loud, but distinct enough for Daniel to recognize. He stood up and walked slowly toward the door. Through the gap in the curtain, he saw two men getting out of the car. They were dressed in plain clothes, neat in appearance, showing no signs of being local authorities. One glanced toward the field, the other stared directly at the house. They exchanged a few brief words, then stepped onto the porch. The knock came firm but unhurried. Daniel opened the door just wide enough to clearly see the two unfamiliar faces. One of them smiled and introduced themselves, saying they needed to clarify a few details related to a recent matter. The tone was friendly, the form of address carefully chosen. Daniel looked at them for several seconds, his gaze steady and unmoving. He asked, "Show me the warrant." The question was calm, not raised in volume. The man on the left hesitated slightly. The other responded quickly, saying it was not necessary yet. The voice carried a trace of impatience, thinly concealed. Daniel immediately understood what that answer meant. No paperwork, no recognized authority. Daniel did not step outside. He remained at the threshold, maintaining distance. The two men exchanged a very quick look. Their initial patience vanished. One stepped forward and reached toward Daniel's arm, as if intending to guide him outside for a more convenient conversation. The hand made contact with his sleeve. In that instant, Daniel turned. The movement was compact and decisive. Without flourish, he shifted his weight into the wooden doorframe, using his own body mass as leverage. The man was pulled off balance, his footing slipping from the porch step. A heavy sound followed as he fell hard onto the ground. The other man reacted half a beat too late. He moved forward, but Daniel had already retreated inside. The door slammed shut. Daniel turned the bolt and secured the lock. The metallic sound rang clearly in the quiet space. Outside, hurried footsteps followed, and a hand struck the door hard. Daniel stood close to the door, his voice carrying through the thick wood. "You have just made a mistake." He did not shout. He did not need to. The sentence was enough to establish a boundary. Outside, the two men spoke urgently to each other. Daniel heard a radio click on, a low and hurried voice following. He stepped back, keeping a safe distance. In Daniel's mind, everything was unfolding, exactly according to the logic he had anticipated. When orders are issued from the shadows, those who carry them out often believe they can act faster than the system. They believe that an old man living alone will not cause trouble. That belief is what leads them to make mistakes. Daniel took his phone from his pocket and pressed a familiar sequence. The small device emitted a brief signal, then went silent. He placed the phone on the table, his eyes still fixed on the door. Outside, the pounding lessened. The two men began to retreat, their voices over the radio growing more urgent. Daniel did not move. He waited. Time passed slowly. Second by second, he heard an engine start, then stop. Their hesitation was clear. They understood that the situation had moved beyond their original calculation. They no longer controlled the pace. Then light swept across the window. A strong, even beam moved slowly along the opposite wall. Daniel saw his reflection before hearing the familiar engine sound. Federal vehicle lights illuminated the dirt road in front of the house, washing over the porch and the two men standing frozen in place. Daniel did not step outside. He remained inside the house, listening to car doors opening and the sound of organized footsteps. Short commands rang out, clear and precise. The two men were ordered to lower their hands and stand still. There was no argument. There was no chance to flee. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. He knew that from this point forward, everything would be recorded differently. What had happened at his doorstep had just crossed the line of a covert act. It had become an event that could not be concealed. He moved closer to the door and placed his hand on the bolt, but did not open it immediately. He waited until he heard a familiar voice outside, signaling that everything was under control. Only then did Daniel open the door and step onto the porch, facing the bright lights and faces that were no longer unfamiliar. The dirt road in front of his house was now as bright as daytime. The two men in plain clothes stood apart, held at a safe distance. Daniel looked at them once, then turned toward the federal agents. He gave a slight nod. No further explanation was needed. Behind him, the house door remained open. Inside, everything was quiet. Daniel knew that the most dangerous part had just passed, but the story was not over. What had just occurred would set off another chain of consequences at a higher level, where decisions would no longer be made in the dark. The federal vehicle lights continued to illuminate the dirt road, a clear signal that the boundary had been redrawn. And this time, there was no place for those who arrived without a warrant. Federal vehicle lights continued to illuminate the dirt road as two plainclothes men were instructed to stand apart. Every movement unfolded cleanly, with no significant resistance. Handcuffs closed, a dry metallic sound cutting through the night. An officer stepped forward, confiscating phones and radios, placing each device into sealed evidence bags. Light swept across a screen that had just gone dark, leaving faint fingerprints behind. Everything was documented in sequence, one step at a time. Daniel Cooper stood by the porch, watching the scene before him. He neither stepped forward nor backed away. What needed to happen had already happened. Federal agents arrived in time, before another scenario could be staged. Daniel recognized that a boundary had just been redrawn, not through words, but through the timely presence of authority. An officer opened the first phone, moving quickly and extracting data according to procedure. Messages appeared clearly, a series of concise directives with no embellishment. The name William Crowley appeared as the sender. The information was captured, encrypted, and entered into the record. No speculation was required. No interpretation was needed. The data stream was sufficient to establish the origin of the order. Daniel was invited to sit inside, away from the night wind. He complied, slowly. In the small living room, the light was switched on. An officer asked a few confirming questions, and Daniel answered briefly. He did not recount the events that had occurred earlier. Everything that had just happened had witnesses, documentation, and evidence. A few days later, a federal hearing was convened. The meeting room was far larger than the town courtroom, evenly lit, with a long table covered in documents. General Michael Abrams was present early, seated in the position reserved for the relevant agency representative. He did not speak first. He waited for his turn, as he always did when everything had been fully prepared. Daniel entered carrying a slim briefcase. He placed it on the table, opened it, and laid out each file in a sequence that had been marked beforehand. Technical maps, environmental reports, declassified appendices, and records related to the land and the former base. There were no unnecessary papers, no embellishments. Each file served a clear purpose. When invited to speak, Daniel stood. He looked around the room, not seeking any particular gaze. He stated that he was not opposing the court. The sentence rang out, low and clear. He continued, saying that he opposed turning the court into a tool to silence those without power. There was no emphasis, no raised voice. The words were placed where they belonged. At the right moment, Abrams followed, presenting the sequence of events in chronological order. The suspension of the local trial, signs of evidence removal, unlawful interference, and orders issued from an interregional supervisory level. He did not use accusatory language. He used data, numbers, timestamps, signatures, seals. Everything is connected on its own. Groundwater samples were introduced. Test results appeared clearly on the large screen. Contamination levels exceeding safety thresholds. Heavy metals and industrial solvents present exactly where old technical records had marked. This confirmation quieted the room. This was no longer a story about a small structure. It was the consequence of prolonged burial and neglect. A legal representative asked Daniel why he had not reported the issue earlier. Daniel replied that reporting had been carried out through proper channels at the time and that the records had been archived. He stated that his responsibility then was technical, not communicative. He did not speculate about the motives of those who came later. He simply reiterated what had been documented. When the name William Crowley was clearly identified within the chain of directives, the room shifted into a different state. Questions focused on authority, on the abuse of a supervisory position to influence local procedures. Answers were immediately cross-checked against the collected data. There was no room to evade. The hearing lasted many hours. No one delivered speeches. No one sought to impress. What was presented was sufficient to determine responsibility and sufficient to trigger the next steps under federal law. When it concluded, the decision was announced succinctly. The land conversion project was frozen. The area was placed under mandatory environmental remediation. The individuals involved were suspended from duty pending investigation. Daniel sat down and closed his briefcase. He did not request personal compensation. When asked, he stated that what he needed was for the land to be properly treated and for all records to be publicly disclosed. The request was acknowledged, with no further debate required. Abrams stood and nodded to Daniel. There was no prolonged handshake. No congratulations. Recognition lay in the fact that the process had moved in the right direction. People in the room began gathering their materials, shifting to their next tasks. The hearing ended simply, as it should have. Outside, the sky was clear. Daniel stepped into the hallway, natural light falling across him. He paused briefly, then continued walking. Years of working in silence had taught him that justice does not need spectacle to exist. It needs to be placed in the right hands, at the right time. The news spread in its own way, not loudly, not sensationally. Brief statements, lines of confirmation, enough for those involved to understand that a layer of cover had been removed, enough for plans once advanced in silence to be halted. Daniel returned to the wooden house. The land where the warehouse had once stood was temporarily fenced for survey work. Warning signs had been erected. He stood watching for a moment, then went back inside. Life resumed its familiar rhythm. He brewed coffee, opened a window, and let the wind in. If you believe that justice should not belong to those with power, leave a comment saying, "The truth must be made public," and subscribe to the channel, because in real life, stories like this are still unfolding. The afternoon descended slowly. Sunlight slanted across the fields, reflecting off the old steel fence. Daniel sat at the table, looking out. He no longer thought about the hearing. He thought about maps that had been put back in their proper place, about final numbers that had been read for what they truly meant. The warehouse was gone, but what had once been buried beneath it, the truth, contempt, and systemic violence against the powerless, no longer had anywhere to hide. This story does not end with a hearing, nor does it stop with one man being vindicated. It ends with a truth buried for many years, finally forced into the open, not because someone shouted, but because someone was patient enough to stand still and keep watching. Daniel Cooper did not seek attention, did not need apologies, and did not need a grand speech. He did the one thing the system feared most. He kept the records, preserved the memory, and held his ground until everything collapsed under its own weight. In real life, stories like this are not rare. They are simply rarely told in full, because justice does not always arrive with lights, and not everyone oppressed gets a chance to speak. If you have followed this far, you may understand that feeling, the feeling of power being misused and silence being exploited. If you believe the truth deserves to be seen, that justice should not belong to the stronger but to the rightful, press follow and subscribe. Each follow is a way for stories like this to continue being told, to be preserved rather than erased in silence. And if this story made you think, leave a comment, because sometimes it only takes one person to speak for others to dare to listen.